Right. Shall we begin, Kavita? Is that
Yeah, we can begin. Like
all
I
right?
think,
Great.
or we can start answering if some, or we can start discussing about something, and by the time more people will join.
Sure, sure. Yeah, because there is already a question for me in the discussion forum. I'll just read that out. This is by from Pratik Chaudhary, and he says, "Suppose I visit a random forest or any kind of natural habitat, and I make a checklist of all the living beings of the habitat. So basically, going to a habitat and finding out all the species that are present in the habitat. Now, can I tell that all the species are found living together in the area has formed a community? Or is a separate study needed to determine if they are interacting with each other? And the reason for that question is that one of the definitions, one of the most broad and general definitions of a community is a set of species that are present in the same place at the same time and are either actually interacting with each other or are could potentially interact with each other. So that's a very broad definition of the community. Uh, and for all practical purposes, if you actually go to, let's say, a grassland habitat and you find out all the species that are found in the grassland habitat, then you can say, without knowing whether those species are interacting with each other or whether they're actually interacting with each other or whether they can potentially interact, you could say that this is the grassland community. Um, so, so some interactions are quite obvious, right? If you go to grassland and you see um, a falcon eating another bird species, that's an example of an interaction called predation, which is very very obvious. But there could be other subtle interactions either that are not directly visible to us or they could be indirect interactions that are very difficult to actually quantify, that are very difficult to in some cases even realize that there are those indirect interactions happening. So as a general rule, you can talk of the community of organisms in a grassland, in a forest, in any kind of habitat. Um, but quantifying interactions is a different sort of identifying and quantifying interactions is a different undertaking. It's a different effort, and some of those interactions might be difficult to even recognize and study. So some of these interactions in communities are things like competition, predation, facilitation or symbiosis. Predation is where one organism is eating another. Uh, Competition is where two organisms are using the same resource and therefore they both have negative effects on each other in terms of population growth rate. So that's what was in the discussion forum. I don't think there are any more questions on the discussion forum for this particular um, module. Um, but of course, if you have any questions, please do post them in the chat box or you can ask them directly. Um, and community ecology, generally, a lot of attention has been paid to interactions like competition and interactions like predation in attempting to explain why you see a community that has these many species and the abundances of those species follow a certain pattern. Competition has been the predominant sort of people have given a lot of importance to competition. But and and predation to a slightly lesser extent, competition and predation. If you know, then both competition and predation have um, both those interactions have negative impacts on at least one of those species in the community. So when you're talking about competition, if species A and species B are feeding on the same food in the community, then if you add individuals of species A, they will deplete more food, leading to negative impacts on species B, and vice versa. With predation, the predator is gaining benefits. So it's positive for the predator, that interaction, but it's negative for the prey. The prey actually dies, it loses fitness completely. Um, and over the last 10 or 20 years, people are also looking more closely at facilitative interactions, which are interactions where both of the participants benefit. And these are very common in nature. Coral reefs, for example, arise from a symbiosis between two different types of organisms. Um, Plants gain from pollinators because the pollinators actually lead to the production of fruit, and the pollinators gain from plants in terms of nutrients. Similarly, there are plant seed disperser networks where both the participants benefit from that interaction. So facilitation is also a huge part of community structuring, how communities are structured.
Students can also post your comments or suggestions about the course, like whether something we need to improve or something. If you have suggestions, please, you can directly talk to Professor Umesh or you can direct or post in the chat box.
Prabhita, should we just wait for another 5 minutes in case people join? And then if there are no questions live, then students can always ask on the discussion forum. But if we just wait for 5 minutes and see if there are any more questions.
So we can do that.
All right.
I think this is like since it's a working day and it's like a class hour, maybe like less students will join, I assume. So
Right, right. So maybe the questions will come on onto the discussion forum
yeah,
rather
of course.
than, yeah.
Yeah, we can wait for like 15 minutes or something, and then if nobody is asking anything, we can wrap up the.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Priyanka has a question regarding the assignment question number 8. So let's just go to that. So, Priyanka, this is the question on. Can you confirm if it's the question on random variation in birth rates and death rates? Is that the question? Oh, spreading speed of an infectious disease. I see. So that's not my module, but let me see if I can answer that. Um, which module is this?
Priyanka, can you post the question itself?
Yes, please. That would be great. I'm looking at this, but I'm not finding anything to do with. Okay, sure.
It's week 7 assignment, question number 9.
Week 7 assignment.
Question number 9. Which one or more of the situation is associated with high, high spread of an infectious disease? I have corrected the answer, but I want to know how,
Ah,
like,
okay.
I need an explanation of that question.
Umesh, I have posted the question in the chat box.
Okay,
Which
so
one?
there's two questions here in the chat box.
Which one
Uh,
of which one or more of these situations is
yes, yes,
associated with?
yes, I found that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's deal with that question first. Which one or more of these situations is associated with the high spread of an infectious disease? Um, Reproductive rate of the pathogen is high, mortality rate of the host is extremely high, the pathogen spreads through air, high density of the host population. Um, so, if the mortality rate of the host is extremely high, then it's unlikely that the pathogen would spread because you would require the pathogen to incubate in the host and then be able to spread from the host to other host individuals. But if the reproductive rate of the pathogen is high, the mortality rate of the the pathogen spreads through the air, which is much easier to spread through the air, for example, things like influenza or COVID, rather than things like HIV, which require things like blood transfusion or they're sexually transmitted. So there, the spread of those infections will be slower than the spread of infections in something like COVID. And if the host population density is high, then the probability that the pathogen jumps from one host individual to the other is also high. So, Prabita, what was the answer given for this?
Is
So,
A, C, and D.
A, C, and D?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That sounds right to me. Because fast reproducing pathogen that can be spread through the air and in a population that is very, very dense will cause that epidemic to spread, infectious disease to spread very, very fast. Whereas if your host is dying very soon in response to the infection, then perhaps the pathogen does not have time to in a host to be able to reproduce enough and then spread to another host individual. I have another question here in the chat box. According to the competitive exclusion principle, complete competitors cannot exist together. Can you please give one example of where a stronger competitor excluded a weaker competitor in nature? Um, this is a great question, and the principle of competitive exclusion which was formulated or stated in 1934 by Gauss. It's also called Gauss's law. Was exactly this, that complete competitors cannot coexist, which has been criticized uh, by a number of people, um, including Garrett Hardin, who in 1960 publishes papers saying all of those terms are vague. What is a complete competitor? How do you, what is coexistence? Um, a bunch of people actually took these flower beetles and put them in well, anyway, that example was you can look up on the lecture itself. But in reality, in practice, what happens with the principle of competitive exclusion is that we go out into the wild, right? We'll go out into nature and then we'll say, hey, look, these two species are very similar to each other, and they're not found in the same location. The geographical ranges of these two species do not overlap. Look, that's an example of competitive exclusion because these species are so similar that they're not able to coexist with each other. And there are multiple examples of very similar species that do not coexist in space. And so you've got, for example, low elevation species and mid elevation species on a mountain. The low elevation species does not go into the mid elevation. The mid elevation species does not come down into the low elevations. So those two species, it's assumed that that's the result of competitive exclusion. The low elevation species competitively excludes the mid elevation species from occupying low elevations, and the mid elevation species competitively excludes the lower elevation species from occupying the mid elevation species. Mid elevations, and one of the classic examples of that is I've just posted that in the chat box. This genus called Cyanoderma, uh, which is a genus of um, babblers found in the Himalayas. Is a number of bird species of this genus, and the rufous-fronted babbler and the rufous-capped babbler look and behave very similar to each other. But they're not found in the same elevation. The rufous fronted is found lower down, the rufous capped is found higher up. Uh, in practice, so you if you see this pattern, one would say, oh, rufous fronted is competitively excluding rufous capped, and rufous capped is competitively excluding rufous fronted. But there are lots of instances where, for us, if we look at the species, we think the species are very similar to each other. And given that they're so similar, we would expect that those two species would not co-occur in the same location. But they do. We see that they do coexist. And so our ideas of, oh, you know, these species should be competitively excluding each other, but they're not. And then the conclusion often reached is, yes, they are very similar to each other. They should competitively exclude each other, but there's something perhaps that we have not measured, some important way in which these species differ from each other, that makes them not complete competitors and therefore allows them to coexist. So in practice, it's actually quite difficult to either show or exclude the possibility of competitive exclusion. So, Pravita, it seems like there aren't any more questions here today. So, shall we just wait for questions to be posted to the discussion forum? Oh, okay,
Sir,
good.
there's one.
There is a question here from Priyanka. Can we have some graph module based questions? Graph module. Priyanka, can you elaborate on that, please? I'm not quite sure what that means. Graph module. Was it a module on graphs?
Priyanka, can you
Is
unmute
this
yourself?
is this
Sir,
related to study design?
graph based question, sir.
Sorry, you are not audible. Can you repeat?
Since sir, I'm traveling, so there is a network issue. So
Uh, Umesh, did you
Okay,
understood
so
what
there
we
is
said?
so Priyanka has left. I think she's got some network issues because she's traveling. But there's another question that Mullerian mimicry is a case of mutualism. There is also Batesian mimicry. Can we consider that also as a case of mutualism? So, Mullerian mimicry is this phenomenon where you have two species, both of which are toxic or dangerous, and both of them over evolutionary time start looking like each other. And so, if a predator attacks one of those species, an individual from one of those two species, and then has a bad experience because it's toxic, right? The species is poisonous, and so the predator might vomit and have all sorts of other kinds of symptoms of poisoning. Then it learns that an individual that looks like that is to be avoided in the future. And so, if the predator is trained on um, an individual of species A, it will avoid an individual of species B because an individual of species B looks like the individual of species A. Um, So that's Mullerian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is a situation in which uh, the the model or species that is toxic looks a certain way. The mimic that copies the model is not toxic, but it looks like the model. It looks like the toxic species. And so, if the predator has a bad experience with species A, it will avoid species B, even though species B is non toxic and the predator can eat it safely. So, this would not be an instance of mutualism. In Muller mimicry, the predator could first encounter either species A or species B, and when it does that, it will then in the future avoid both A and B. So you could train on either A, you could encounter either A or B, and the copying of each other is mutually beneficial. In Bates and mimicry, uh, only the mimic benefits, right? It's actually producing toxins, producing poison is costly. You have to invest energy in producing these things. And so the Batesian mimic actually is benefiting because it's not producing uh, poisons or toxins. It's not investing that energy. It's just simply copying the model and benefiting from that. So there's no mutualism there in that case. It's just a benefit for the mimic. So Priyanka sent me a message saying, "Can you say how facilitation is the answer? Why not competition and predation?" No, sorry if I gave that impression. That's not what I meant. I just said that in terms of research that has been conducted in the past, there's been a lot of focus on competition and predation. Competition and predation are important determinants of community structure. There's no doubt about that. But it's just that facilitation for a long time was sort of ignored and now people are studying facilitation and understanding that facilitation is also very, very important determinant of community structure and community assembly. And so it's actually all of these processes operating together that structure communities: competition, predation, facilitation, and so on. All of them are important. It's not that facilitation, only facilitation is the answer. The relative strengths of competition, predation, and facilitation can vary from community to community, but all of them are likely to be acting in a system. And then there's another question. The fundamental niche can be smaller than the realized niche in the presence of competition, predation, parasitism, or facilitation. Um, the fundamental niche can be smaller than the realized niche in the presence of competition, predation, parasitism. Um, Sorry, let me just go to that assignment. Uh, the fundamental niche can be smaller than the realized niche in the presence of facilitation. Yes, that's correct. The fundamental niche is the niche or the area that a species can occupy in the absence of any species interactions. The realized niche is the area that the species actually occupies, right? It's the space that the species actually occupies. So when you've got competition or predation or parasitism, what's happening is that those processes, competition, predation, and parasitism, are actually reducing the area that a species occupies. So a species can occupy a larger area, but because it's competing with some other species, it's not able to occupy the other area because of the presence of the competitor. Same with the presence of the predator or the parasite. And so the fundamental niche of a species will be larger than the realized niche where the species actually found in the presence of things like competition, predation, and parasitism. Whereas in facilitation, what happens is that the fundamental niche can actually be larger than the realized niche because the presence of a species is actually allowing another species to occupy that location, which it would not be able to occupy in the absence of the species. So competition, predation, parasitism reduce the space that a species occupies, whereas facilitation increases that space that a species occupies, and that's why the fundamental niche can be larger than the realized niche. Sorry, the realized niche can be larger than the fundamental niche in the um, in the case of facilitation. Prabita, if there are no more questions, shall we end the session?
We can wait for 10 minutes, and is that fine?
Sure. Sure, 10 minutes is fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can switch off the camera you want, if you want. Like if we can wait for the chat section whether something will come up.
Sure, that sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. Umesh, can you hear me? Can you?
Yes, I can see that question there. Fundamental niche can be larger due to facilitation, but fundamental niche is smaller due to facilitation. No. The fundamental niche is smaller in the case of facilitation than the realized niche. The fundamental niche is the space occupied by the species in the absence of any interactions with other species. Right? What happens with facilitation? What happens with facilitation is when there is another species that is facilitating, so let's say species A is facilitating species B, right? Now, in the absence of species A, B can occupy a certain limited area. But when A is present, B is able to expand the area that it occupies, which is its realized niche. The realized niche being what is the area occupied by the species in the presence of species interactions, right? So let's contrast these two things: competition and facilitation. If you've got two species X and Y that are competing with each other, then if X is absent, Y is able to occupy a much larger space. Yes, because the competitive effects of X are not present on Y. Whereas if X is present and that species interaction is happening between X and Y, then Y occupies a smaller space. That is the realized niche of Y in the presence of X. The fundamental niche of Y is what is the area it could occupy in the absence of X, right? So in the case of competition, the realized niche is smaller than the fundamental niche. Now, if you contrast that with facilitation, if A is facilitating B, yeah, then B is able to occupy a larger space in the presence of A. So its realized niche is actually larger than the fundamental niche which is the area it would occupy in the absence of A. And therefore, the fundamental niche can be smaller than the realized niche in the presence of facilitation.
Wish, can you accept this question? Wish, can you hear me?
Oh, okay. There's another question in the chat. Um, how urbanization contribute in increasing the spread of zoonotic disease? Um, Generally, any form of disturbance to natural habitats, including urbanization, leads to an increased probability of the transmission of zoonotic disease. So, zoonotic disease is basically a disease or an infection that spills over from a wild animal to human beings. Examples of zoonotic disease are COVID, HIV, Ebola, and so on, that have all jumped from an animal to a human. What happens when you disturb habitats? What happens when you um, alter, if you create a city in the middle of natural habitat? What happens there is two things. One is well, many things, but of those couple of those things that might increase the probability in the spread of zoonotic disease is that humans and animals come into closer contact. You might not realize this because you're not directly in contact with these animals. I mean, bats, for example, right? Bats are important, significant reservoirs of zoonotic disease. So you're coming into increased contact with. So if you plant fruiting trees in your city and the bats are using those trees, then the urine and the feces of these bats, you might come into contact with that, leading to the spread of viruses from the bats to human beings. So you're coming into increased contact with wild animals when you cause disturbance. The other thing is that it also causes increased stress in these wild animals, right? You're changing the habitat that causes stress. Stress causes the immune system of these animals to not work as effectively, basically increasing the risk of infection and increasing viral loads, and causing these stressed animals to shed or to shed more virus in their excretion, which again can lead to the spillover of infections from humans to animals. There's another question that's just come in. Taiga includes coniferous leaves, then why is it the answer as Himalayan regions has these types of trees? India's biogeographic zones do not include which of the following habitat? Savanna, taiga, rainforest, mangrove. So Priyanka, it's not just about the presence of coniferous trees that is the fundamental characteristic of the taiga. The taiga actually is dominated not as much by coniferous trees, but it's dominated by species like birch, um, which which are not non-coniferous. They're not coniferous. The taiga is actually a habitat that is characteristic. It's often marshy, swampy, wet, and it's found in northern Korea, uh, parts of China, Russia, and then the boreal forests in Canada and so on. But the taiga is not found south of that. It's not found within our country. So although we do have coniferous trees in the Himalayas, um, and there are coniferous forests there at higher elevations in the Himalayas, it's not really taiga. Taiga is a let me just find that, very specific habitat that is found in predominantly Russia and Canada. So taiga does have a lot of coniferous trees, for sure, but it also has species like birch. Uh, but it has other characteristics that that make it that it's not found in India. Um, why are bats considered important reservoirs for many zoonotic diseases? Bats are important reservoirs for many zoonotic diseases. Um, you know, Bats have viruses that are capable of infecting human beings, and so a lot of these viruses that are found in bats are actually capable of jumping from bats to human beings, like primates, for example. Right, primates are also reservoirs for zoonotic diseases. HIV, for example, uh, originates in primates. Um, So, jumping from a bat or a primate to a human being is far more likely for a virus to do than jumping, for example, from a bird to a human being, because bird viruses tend not to be as easy to their characteristics and their what these viruses can actually potentially infect. Bird viruses tend not to infect or cause disease in human beings. Um, so that's why bats and primates are considered um, important reservoirs for zoonoses. So I think some of these questions are direct messages to me, and the others in the meeting can't see them. So there's a question that's addressed directly to me, which is how does resource partitioning help competing species coexist? So what resource partitioning does is that it reduces the strength of competition. So if you've got two species that are feeding on exactly the same resource or using exactly the same resource, then they're likely to be competing very, very strongly with each other. If then the two species slightly change the resources that they're using, then the strength of competition between those two species will come down. And if the strength of competition between those two species comes down, then they're able to coexist. They're able to exist in the same location because they are changing, they're partitioning resources amongst themselves, right? What you've got is two species changing in the kind of resources that they're using. And because they're changing the kind of resources that they're using, they compete less with each other and therefore are able to coexist. So I think people who are posting messages, can you please post it to the group as a whole so that they can also see the questions that are being asked? So the question is in a real world application, how can we design an experiment to test for competition between bird species in a shared habitat or niche? It's very difficult. It's very difficult to test for competition. Often, the way in which competition is inferred that two species are competing with each other, the way in which people reach that conclusion is by looking at the traits of two species, two bird species, looking at their body sizes, the morphology of their beaks, and saying, oh, these two species are likely to be competing with each other, and then they look at the geographical range of species, and often two species that are very closely related will not co-occur in the same geographical space. One species will be found in a certain range, and another species will be found in a separate geographical range. That's how people have concluded that two species are likely to be competing. The test for competition is the ideal test for competition is to take those two species, add or remove individuals of one of those species, and see how the population growth rates or the population sizes of the other species changes as a result. As you can imagine, that's a very difficult thing to do. Um, um, because you can't actually manipulate these population sizes in the wild. The other way in which people have concluded that competition is actually occurring is through something called character displacement, where if you have two species, one species occupies a certain range, the other species occupies another range, and then the two species co-occur in some, their ranges overlap in in some part of the ranges overlap, then the two species become more dissimilar to each other where the ranges overlap, and that it's thought to be because they're partitioning resources in the areas where they overlap. Whereas in areas where only the two species or only one species is found, then the traits of those species don't need to diverge to avoid competition. And this is something called character displacement. You can look up what character displacement is. Um, One of the other ways in which people have inferred competition is by looking at um, mainland island systems, where on the mainland, on the continent, you can have, um, say, three species belonging to a particular genus. And then on the island, you actually have only one species. So where you have three species on the mainland, the densities of each of those species tends to be low. The population size of each of those species tends to be low. Whereas on the island, where you have only one species, the population size of that one species really becomes very, very high. This is something called ecological release. And the inference is on the island that species does not have the two other competing species, and therefore it can increase its population size in the absence of competition. But designing a real world experiment in nature to test competitive effects is quite a difficult thing to do.
Which we can wind up in 2 minutes. So if you want to mention something general to the students, you can do that now. Umesh, am I audible? Am I audible to anybody?
Yes, 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 Pravita, you're audible.
Like we will
So,
wind up in 1 minute. So if you have
yes, sure. Yeah, we wind up in one
general.
minute. We'll wind up in 1 minute. Yeah, so community ecology is quite an interesting field. Um, People have started doing very interesting experiments nowadays with communities that were not really done in the past, because manipulating these systems is quite difficult, especially systems that are very, very complex, that have a large number of species. Um, but it's a very exciting field of research. It's one of the fastest growing fields of research in ecology. So if you're interested in community ecology, um, do look up. I'll just post. Um, do look up this community ecology textbook. Oh, I've sent that to. That's gone to Priyanka directly. You can meeting group chat. I'll put that in the meeting group chat. That's a very nice, relatively recent community college textbook. Okay, yeah. Thank you all for joining today and for your questions and for that interesting discussion. Uh, and we'll meet again at some point with the other modules as well. So, thanks and take care. Goodbye.